start at the beginning. In 1739, Angus McCaskill left the Isle of Skye in Scotland to try and go to the Americas. He made it and landed somewhere in what's now New Jersey. Angus only stayed for a few months before he decided he wasn't happy there and headed north towards the Cape Cod area. He'd set himself up as a fisherman and was doing rather well, all things considered. But he hadn't been a fisherman in Scotland and didn't know how to read the waves and wind correctly. He had set off in the early morning to one of his favorite spots before most everyone else had been awake, and taken his boat out into a red morning. Every other seasoned fisherman knew it wasn't worth going out that day, and a few shouted at Angus from the dock, but he didn't hear them. He was excitedly sailing towards his next haul. As expected, the storm struck with plenty of unheeded warning. Angus's small craft was tossed about, lurching this way and that. He managed to keep himself inside the boat, but the same couldn't be said for the majority of his belongings and tools. Besides one drenched and shivering Scotsman, the boat only held an extra pair of boots. The storm eventually subsided, and Angus had tied himself to the boat in efforts to keep from being tossed into the ocean. It had worked, and next he opened his eyes, the storm was gone, and the boat was bumping up against a beach. The ocean had delivered him miles away from the dock he'd set off from, and staring down at him were a group of fellow Scotsmen that he recognized by the plaids around their waist and shoulders and the knotwork on their clothes. He spoke to them in his mother tongue, begging for help. "I've been knocked away from my fishing spot. Where am I? Can you help me get home?" he asked, and the others remained staring at him silently until one elderly woman stepped forward. The others moved out of the way for her. She spoke in the same tongue. "Where are you from?" "The Isle of Skye." "What clan do you hail from?" "McCaskill." The elder's eyebrow rose nearly imperceptibly. She stood straight and gestured for two men nearby to untie Angus from his boat. As he stood, she motioned for him to follow her and headed into the forest at the edge of the beach. They walked for what felt like hours, but Angus's perception of time was absolutely lost thanks to the storm. He tried to tell what time it was by the height of the sun, but he didn't even know what was east and what was west right then. It could have been morning or evening. They walked until the group, Angus realized belatedly that the others had come along, came to a different beach, and the elder pointed out across a strip of water to a larger island, flanked with cliffs and one point reaching towards the island they were on. He squinted, trying to bring what looked like a roughly hewn path up the cliffs into focus. "Up there you will find your luck, McCaskill," the elder spoke, and then lowered her arm to turn to him. "Will you take it?" "My luck?" The elder only nodded in response. She turned further, nodding to her people. They turned as a group, leaving Angus bewildered on the beach. All she'd said was that he was going to find his luck. That could have meant anything. He squinted at the path in the cliffs again, glanced over his shoulder, and took a step forward. He'd come back to this island and ask for an explanation after he'd climbed the cliffs. If his luck was up there, he was going to get it. He'd expected the climbing part to be the hardest. He was half right. The strip of water, only a little wider than a large river really, proved to have a powerful current running through it. The bottom of it was walkable, mostly. Angus had been trying to dig his feet into the soft sand with every step in attempts to not get washed away, but he could see that he was getting pushed further and further left of the cliff path. Angling himself towards it once more, he pressed on. One misstep, one too sure planting of a foot, and he'd gone under. There was a dip in the riverbed, and Angus's sinuses filled with stinging seawater. He had never been so glad he knew how to swim. The current was doing its absolute best to drag him with it, but Angus fought and kicked and grabbed onto every rock he could, dragging himself forward and up. His head broke the surface, and he clung to the large boulder that had given him the chance, coughing up salt water and trying to see how far off his target he was now. Only a little more than before, and much closer to the other side of the water. With a deep breath, coughed out and replaced with another, Angus pushed forward. The cliff pathway was in focus now. He could see it clearly, and he would climb it. The boulder provided an excellent handhold as he dragged himself forward, using every muscle in his body to fight against the current. He won. The shore was mere feet away, and the riverbed was rising. His chest was entirely out of the water now. Still, he forced himself through, diving and kicking and fighting for the shore. The long grasses at the edge were his ropes. His fingers tangled tightly in them as Angus hauled himself out of the water and over the edge of the riverbank. This side of the water dropped off suddenly. There was no smooth sandy beach lowering itself gently into the tide. There was probably a gentler entry point to this larger island, but it didn't matter now. Angus had made it to the other side. He lay on the riverbank for a while, catching his breath and regaining his strength. His sinuses still burned with the seawater, his muscles traced with matching fire. The long grass that had provided him a handhold now cradled his body entirely. Arms spread wide, spine gratefully rested against soft earth. He laid there until he felt the beat of his heart gradually slow, the adrenaline start to peter out and fade. I will sleep if I stay here, he thought, allowing his eyes to stay closed to the count of 30 before forcing himself to sit up, and then with much groaning and difficulty, stand. The cliff face he was closest to stretched high over his head, the tip of it fuzzy in view. This island was tall, no wonder a path had to be literally cut into it. His gaze returned to the ground at his feet instead of 40 feet above his head, and traced a pathway from where he stood to the edge of the cliff pathway. It was rocky, and some of it would be through water again, but it couldn't be as bad as what came before and what was going to come after. He'd climbed cliffs and rock-faced on sky. He knew the terror of slipping and finding yourself dangling from a handhold by the tips of your fingers. He prayed these cliffs would be more forgiving. But first he had to get to them. So he picked his way across the rock and puddle, long grass pulling at his ankles and begging him to stay. He nearly lost his boot at one point and managed to wrestle it free with the bonus reward of falling back onto the rocks. That was the only incident that had made him angry instead of more determined. So, angrily, he shoved the boot back on his foot and cursed that particular patch of grass in Gaelic, kicking a rock into the puddle for good measure. A petty revenge, to be sure, but a revenge all the same. No further boot feed made any attempt as Angus made his way across the rocky shore, and finally he stood at the foot of the cut cliff pathway. It stretched high, disappearing into the cliffs at some points, and then reappearing in places that seemingly made no sense. But Angus was sure if he just stuck to the path, he'd come out on top, figuratively and literally. And so, after pulling his shirt off to wring it out as best he could, he pulled it back over his head, ignored the squelching sound of soaked socks and soaked boots, and tried not to think about how long exactly he'd been wet. The pathway started off easy, a walking trail worn smooth by many feet over many years. It inclined at a steady pace, and was unnervingly narrow in some areas, but for the most part, all Angus needed to do was walk steadily and be sure of his footing. He kept trying to glance up to see how much further he needed to go, but due to the twists and turns of the pathway, there was nearly always some sort of overhang blocking his view. Were he more of the scholarly sort, Angus would have mumbled something to himself about marching towards your goals even in the dark, or some such other platitude, but Angus wasn't the scholarly sort. Thankfully, he had plenty of farming and fishing chores in his bones to give him strength and endurance enough to keep going despite the sound thrashing the waterway had given him. Unbeknownst to him, he was roughly halfway up the cliff when it switched from a slightly difficult height to half hiking and half climbing. The pathway ahead of him looked like a run-down staircase now instead of a worn, smooth incline, and Angus's shoulders dropped in dismay as he laid eyes upon it. A heavy sigh escaped him, and once more he tried to look upwards to see how much further. Once more he was given no answer and no quarter by the cliff currently holding him hostage. And so, with a set of his teeth and a squaring of his shoulders, he began to climb. Angus didn't know it, but the climbing portion of the pathway would only take about 10 minutes until the way ahead became the easiest and gentlest incline he'd see on the cliff face. What he did know was that his shoulders were aching, his soaked boots and socks were definitely going to result in blisters later, and his hands were covered in little scrapes and cuts from the rocks that were making it much harder to grip anything. This time, when he looked up, he could see the edge of the wall he was dragging himself upwards, and it gave him courage to stretch his hand towards the next hold. Each one was well-defined, sticking out as clearly as possible from the rest of the rock in an immediately identifiable pattern. Angus thanked whoever had carved them in his heart, as his throat was too raw and dry to let any words escape it at that moment. His fingertips and palms felt the same, and when he paused to look, there was definitely some blood. The old adage of putting your blood, sweat, and tears came to mind, and Angus idly wondered if he'd end up crying at some point as well. He chuckled to himself, letting the idle thought distract him from the screaming nerve endings in his hands and the burning muscles across the rest of his body. He was nearly to the edge of his cliff, just a little further, a few more handholds and he'd have it. One more, he was there. Pulling hard, he managed to get both elbows over the edge and drag the rest of his body up. He had been expecting to see the rest of the island, maybe a valley, but no. There was about 6 feet of flat ground, and then another cliff. Angus wanted to scream, but refrained. He didn't have enough air in his lungs for the scream he wanted to let out. So instead he hung his head briefly, regrouped, accepted the false hope he'd had, and rolled over to lay down for a while. This landing was large enough, and it felt sturdy enough for him to stretch out and rest on, and maybe look at the state of his hands when he got the strength to lift his arms again. He closed his eyes, fully intending to only rest them for a minute or two, but against his will, Angus fell asleep. A stirring of cool air pulled a shiver from him, and Angus woke with a start, sitting up before the pain in his body could tell him not to. It caught up with him quickly, and Angus laid back down to breathe wide-eyed and tense through it. His whole body was on fire now. Every single bit of him hurt. A groan escaped him and echoed softly off the cliff above and beside. The sun had dipped lower, now only a little ways above water. He'd been climbing and fighting his way up the cliff during the hottest part of the day, and suddenly he was thankful that he'd been soaked while doing it. He was mostly dry now, besides his socks and all the parts of him that had been touching the ground. Angus couldn't stand the feeling anymore, so he sat up and pulled off his boots, turning them over to dump whatever water remained in them out. There wasn't much. His socks may as well have been freshly dunked, however. After a thorough wringing, Angus laid them in a sunspot and turned his attention to his hands. There were no scrapes or cuts that were actively bleeding, nothing deep enough to even need bandaged, really. But oh, how it all stung. He thought briefly about tearing strips from his shirt to protect his hands should he need to climb again, but decided he'd cross that particular bridge when and if he came to it. A few more minutes, his socks a bit drier, Angus stood up with a hand braced against the cliff wall. The pathway in view looked much like the pathway below, worn smooth and gently inclining. The difference now was there was a rope railing tacked into the cliff surface every few feet with what looked like iron hooks. Something to hold on to as you trekked across what Angus could see now was the very top of the cliffs. The beach across the waterway was a little golden dot, barely visible between the trees that surrounded it. He turned his gaze from it and focused ahead. Walking would be so much easier than climbing. It took him longer than he'd expected, and he was starting to feel the heat now that his clothes were dry, but Angus had made it to the top. There he was at the edge of a great meadow in a great valley with what looked like a forest at the other end. The long grass, cousin of the grasses that had pulled him from the river, swayed in the gentle breeze, playing the music only plants can understand. To his left, in the distance but visible, was a wide river that could have been the twin of the one he'd fought across if it weren't for the fact he could see this one was slow-moving. Perhaps there's a waterfall. His idle thought was whisked away on the breeze as he moved forward towards the forest. Small wildflowers tapped and poked against his legs, inspecting this intruder into their midst. They were all various shades of pink, orange, yellow, and white. Had Angus been paying attention to more than just how lovely it was, he would have noticed the curious arrangement of them, the gradient from pink to white in the meadow. Much later it would be pointed out to him, and he would feel a fool for not seeing it before. He made steady progress across the meadow, the easiest walk he'd had all day, letting his fingertips brush against the soft grass and petals that were just at the right height. It was peaceful. He could hear the river to one side and birdsong ahead. The sun was beating down, but the breeze kept off the majority of the heat. It was beautiful. An excellent reward for all his fighting and determination. He imagined building a cabin here, in the midst of these warm-toned flowers, but then shook his head. No, this place must be left untouched, he said. This place is... It took him a moment to turn the word up in his mind. This place is sacred. The forest grew ever closer, the trees becoming less recognizable as he stared at them. They weren't the familiar oaks, ashes, birches he was used to. These had long leaves, spindly branches, and bore fruit. The edge of the forest, orchard, was in his reach, and he soon stood beneath one of the fruits. His curiosity rivaled his hunger and thirst, and Angus decided to take the risk and bite into the fruit he plucked from the tree. Sweet and hydrating juice flooded his taste buds as he bit into the first peach he'd ever eaten. 4 peaches later, Angus was revitalized. He laughed and pulled up the hem of his shirt to try and dry his mouth, tossing the pit of his last fruit aside. It was an orchard, not a forest, and full of sweet, delicious fruit he'd never seen before. A bird chirped overhead, and Angus looked up to see a robin staring back down at him. He grinned at the small creature and followed it as it hopped off the branch and glided away. It led him deeper into the forest, and while Angus couldn't be sure if it was actually leading him or simply flying back to its home, he followed. The robin flapped easily between the peach trees, Angus stepping over roots and fallen fruit, reaching out to grab another peach to save for later. The bird broke through the other side of the orchard, and Angus shielded his eyes momentarily as they adjusted from dapple light to full sun. Ahead of him was, well, the rest of the island. The valley dipped between the cliffs and a mountain range that looked as if it stretched to either side of the island, the river running alongside it. To the other side stretched a great wide plain, more wildflowers and long grass waving in the breeze. Between them was a great forest, definitely a forest this time and not an orchard. Angus could see the tops of pine trees poking out the top of the cluster. He had lost track of the little robin, but it wasn't an issue. There was no way to get lost. The island was mostly flat on this side. He sat down in the grass, his fatigue and muscle pain catching back up to him, and ate the peach he'd carried from the other side of the orchard. The elder had said he'd find his luck, and so he had. A wide open and untouched space with what seemed to be natural resources galore, and a delicious fruit he was already head over heels for. The breeze gently rocked him, and Angus laid down. The sky was darkening now, and he smiled, for he felt no worry. This island, this place, somehow he knew he would be kept safe here. Wild animals would leave him alone, the other Scotsmen seemed content to remain on their island, and the night wouldn't drop to freezing temperatures. His luck was in his hands, beneath his feet, in his lungs now. The very air here tasted of sea salt and new beginnings, and Angus laid there to welcome it all in. What a lucky find, he thought, letting his eyes close as crickets began to sing a gentle lullaby somewhere off near the river. A lucky find. His mother tongue slid across his lips as he whispered to the universe, Faedale.